Berlin was both, almost similarly to Zionism, actually, what I was saying at the beginning in terms of this like queer safe haven and like being a place where like, you can go clubbing and you can have a great time and you can feel free apparently. And on the other hand, I never felt so tokenized, fetishized, and to a degree racialized as a Jew than I did when I was living in Berlin in that period. And it just got worse and worse and worse. At the same time as Palestinians were being even more racialized, right, in tandem with each other. And I felt that in my body when I was there. I really did. But I think at the time I remember thinking this doesn't feel safe. And it's interesting in hindsight to see how true that's become in terms of how the German state has just targeted anti-Zionist Jews and Palestinians like so disproportionately to other communities in the city. It's this weird thing of like both being this incredible space to be queer and kind of a terrible place to be a minority of any other kind.
Hi, welcome to a new episode of This Orient's new podcast. Today, as you can tell, in English. The title of this podcast in German is Geteilte Erinnerung zwischen Palästina, Israel und Deutschland. I guess if we want to keep that meaning in English, we can translate it into both divided and shared memory between Palestine, Israel, and Germany. Now, the reason we are having this conversation in English is because of our guest, Howie Rechavia-Taylor. Howie is both an activist and an academic. He's an organizer with an anti-Zionist organization in Berlin. But he also studies Germany's colonial history and the numerous ways it reaches into the present. Another question that occupies Howie's work is what Zionists have learned from German colonialism, and how we can think about the genocide of the Herero and Nama people and the ongoing genocide in Gaza as belonging to the same history of settler colonialism. We will talk about all of this and much more in the following episode. Sometimes we will mention certain authors or texts. If you want to learn more about them, have a look in our bio. I really hope you enjoy this episode, and if you have any questions or feedback, please write us an email at podcast@thisorient.de. Okay, Howie,
Hello.
it's good to have you.
You too.
We're really excited. Thanks for making this happen. Usually we record in Berlin, but now we're in London in a very tiny room, and it's very hot. As our listeners will know, usually we start with some personal questions to get to know our guest, and we wanted to do the same with you, if that's okay.
Sure.
You grew up in Belgium, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you moved to the UK at some point?
When I was 16, yeah.
You're 16, okay. In your writing, you emphasize that from a young age, you didn't really feel like you belong to Europe. When you were a teenager, the Jewish school that you attended in London, they organized a trip to Israel. I think that was around 2005?
2005, yeah.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that it was there that you found at the time a semblance of belonging or a feeling like you belong.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe explain to us what you felt and what it was like to go to Israel and at that time?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I mean, it's a big question. It's an important one. My parents are from London, and we grew up in Brussels, which I guess is known as the heart of Europe. And I was the only, me and my sister and then one other person, we were the only Jewish people in our school of like 1,200 people. And we were also the only Jewish family in the village that we lived in. And I realized from a very young age that I was racialized, in a way that might be surprising to people, given that I'm white. But in contemporary Belgium, similarly to contemporary Germany, France, I think anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish prejudice is still very prominent, and like the legacy of the Shoah is still very real. And I never felt like I really belonged in Europe. It's hard to kind of put words to what that feels like effectively. But one of the things that was always clear to me is the people that I felt were kind of my close friends and comrades in a way. I didn't know that language as a kid, but were always racialized kids, especially Muslim friends in school. And then when I was, so at the age of like 12, 13, I had my bar mitzvah. I was fairly religious. And I started going on these Jewish youth group camps, basically Jewish youth camps in the UK. And they were very religious and also very Zionist. They still are, most of them. And Zionism then for those youth groups was very much about like a fantasy of Jewish liberation, or like feeling like you could feel safe and secure as a Jew, a European Jew. And for me, that was extremely enticing and persuasive, and at a very deep emotional level. And the way that works has a lot to do with like song and dance and like, you know. So when I went, I mean, even before I went on Israel tour, so Israel tour is this tour that most European Jews and American Jews are sent on when they're 16, as like you go around Israel for a month. And you're supposed to be learning about the country. Actually, you're learning nothing about the country. You're learning like a fantasy of what the country is. And for me, especially as like a young queer person, Israel at that time, because this was 2005, where, you know, like post-Oslo Accords, Israel was far more normalized than it is now in the international sphere, and also very much in it beginning its kind of pinkwashing moment, where
Pinkwashing is
the attempt by the Israeli state to absolve itself of its crimes by making itself look like a safe haven for queer people. And for me, it did that very successfully because I felt very comfortable there.
Yeah.
And like it was kind of a sexual awakening for me as well. Like and Zionism and my own sexuality were like very closely linked to each other.
How is it linked? What I learned about Zionism is that it tried to change a Jewish masculinity. Was that what inspired you, or what excited you, or was it something else?
That's a good question. I think historically Zionism was about like Muskeljudentum, is about like becoming a muscular Jew and getting rid of this effeminacy. You're right. So it's quite strange to think that it would be attractive to like a young, fairly effeminate Jewish person as I was. But I think that I have to think about this.
Yeah. You don't have to answer it.
No, I think it's a really good question, because I think there was something of a shift in the 90s and noughties where like heteronormativity and Zionism were not as closely linked necessarily. And Israel started to sell itself as being able to be both militaristic and muscular, but also gay. You know, in some way.
Like fragile in a way?
Yeah, I don't know if fragility is right, but it was like you could have a good time.
Okay.
You know, you could party a lot.
Yeah.
You could party on the beach. You could be half naked on the, you know, like it was the first time that I saw gay men half naked on the beach, you know. And I think it had to do with that more than anything. I don't know about fragility. I don't know if I would say you could be fragile. I mean, if I'd have moved there, I would have had to join the army, which I would never have wanted to do. So it was more as like a holiday destination.
Yeah. And then 6 years later, you returned, but to Palestine.
Yeah.
I think you went to Ramallah.
I went to Ramallah and Nablus, Hebron and Bethlehem.
What happened in those 6 years, and what? I mean, probably a lot. And what memories do you have from that trip?
Yeah, well, I should say I grew up going a lot. So it wasn't just when I was 16 that I went. I grew up going a lot to see family there. And between when I was 16 and when I was 21, when I ended up going to the West Bank, I very slowly changed my perspective. But that was only, for me personally, that was only in and through learning. So in my undergraduate degree, I studied politics as part of my degree. And in my final year, we learned about the 6-Day War.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting there in these lectures and being like, everything this lecturer is saying is wrong. Like in my mind, I was like, everything is, he must be wrong. And then I had to go and write an essay about it. And I read all these books about the 6-Day War. And I was like, confronted by the evidence that the way I had learned about the 6-Day War was not quite what happened, and that Israel was far more of the aggressor than is made out in that story. And then I felt like I needed to go and see for myself. But I was fairly young compared to when most Jews change their minds. But yeah.
How do you let that knowledge in and not shut
off?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I was very left wing at that stage already, but I was very Zionist.
Yeah.
So I would do things like stand up in the student union. I went to Cambridge University. I stood up in the Cambridge Student Union. Oh, I don't know if this should be on the podcast, but I stood up and I'll think about it. I stood up in Cambridge Student Union with an Israeli flag and said, "I love Israel" in 2008 when during that invasion of Gaza. And all of my friends who were at that time saw themselves as socialists. Right?
Yeah.
They were all opposing the invasion, and I wasn't. Right? So for me, it was like, the way I let the information in is I was like, well, they can't be entirely wrong. But it took me a long time.
Yeah. And when you went to the West Bank, were you surprised, anxious? What did you see? What did you make of it?
I think there are ways in which this story has become a genre. So like Jews telling their stories of how they unlearned Zionism, right? And there are ways in which, especially in the last 3 years, there are ways in which this story, some people will say that they went to the West Bank and they saw how horrifying it was, right? And I think to an extent that was true for me. Like I did see how horrifying it was, but I think actually the major thing for me was seeing Palestinian life, like literally, which is very different to this idea that what I saw was Palestinian suffering. I mean, actually what was just like, I was raised with this idea that Palestinians are not really human. So understanding that there was this huge society on the other side of a wall, literally, that I'd never seen before.
Yeah.
And just meeting Palestinians, and I was there during Ramadan and I went to a couple of iftars. And I remember being literally shocked, which is probably hard for anyone to understand who hasn't been raised with Zionism, but shocked that Palestinians were not spending most of their time plotting how to kill Jews. that was like, wow, okay, this is a diverse society and people are not just spending their time doing this thing that I was told they, do every evening.
Because you said it's a genre, and I agree, like I've encountered this a lot now over the last few years.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Is it something you feel also, the fear of being tokenized in a way, or?
I don't mind being tokenized. I think it's more whatever. Like, but the question is more like, I think it's interesting thing about what is the use of understanding Jewish people's stories when who've moved away from Zionism. I don't know the answer. Yeah, I think it's important. It was especially important in the days and weeks after October 7th. And now at this stage, it's almost become like, I don't think most Jewish people or anyone really have an excuse not, to still be within Zionism. Yeah.
So you were in Ramallah around 2011.
Yes.
And then at some point in the following years, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
you moved to Berlin.
Yeah.
What does
I've been
Ramallah
all
have
over
to
the
do?
place.
What does Ramallah have to do with Berlin,
So-
first of all? And no, you can first say that. What does Ramallah have to do with Berlin? How did you end up in Berlin?
I go into quite a lot of detail about this in the book, but when I was in Palestine, I met a German guy. Basically, long story short, not a Jewish German guy, white Christian German guy but he was out there very unusually doing Palestine solidarity work. And he was working for an organization called Al-Qaws, which is a queer Palestinian organization, which is amazing. And so we kind of fell in love in that context. And I wanted to, aside from him being German, he also has an interesting story because his grandmother is a Holocaust survivor, but he's doesn't identify as Jewish. But yeah, so I spent a lot more time in Germany as a result of being with him. We're still together.
Okay, and in your time living in Berlin, you also did engage in Jewish anti-Zionist activism.
Yes.
So you were part of the Jewish Bund, they're called in Berlin.
Yeah,
and
I was.
so first for us and our listeners,
Yeah.
first, what is the Bund?
Yeah.
What is the history of it or the precedents? And I know you kind of teased this earlier. This is such a broad and also simultaneously anecdotal question to ask. But how was your experience at that time as a Jewish anti-Zionist organizer in Berlin, of all places?
Yeah.
And we're asking this as a lot of the interviews we held until now have dealt with this subject in a more abstract way, maybe.
Yeah.
And I think it would be very fruitful, or we think it would be very fruitful to hear something more tangible and personal. So
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to mention that, I come to this as a non-German Jew, right? So I think my experience of activism in Berlin is very much like as an international Jew, which is some term that Winston Churchill used to describe Jews that he hated, and so I love to use it. Jews without homes, basically. So when I lived there, and I was in and out for 10 years, the what's now the Jewish Bund in Berlin didn't exist. So there was if you wanted to do Jewish anti-Zionist organizing, the only thing that really existed was a group called the Jüdische Antifa. And basically, the Jüdische Antifa back then, they were doing really good work, important work, in a moment where, your listeners will know, but a moment where every year things were getting worse and worse when it came to like the German government's anti-Semitism, or like fake philo-Semitism, essentially, that was positioning Jews as somehow those who needed saving by the German state in comparison to other racialized populations, and pitting us against other racialized populations in Germany. Yeah, so that was there was the Jüdische Antifa and there was Jüdische Stimme. These were the two organizations. Jüdische Stimme is very much focused on Palestine, Israel-Palestine. So it was less focused on German domestic politics. Jüdische Antifa was more focused on German domestic politics. The thing with the Jüdische Antifa at that time when I came there, and that was difficult and alienating for me, was that it was majority Ashkenazi Israelis. And without wanting to kind of spend too much time on this, it's really important for Germans to understand that Jewish people are not a monolith, right? And that even Ashkenazi Jews are not a monolith, and that the experience of an Ashkenazi Israeli in 48 Palestine is very different from the experience of an Ashkenazi Jew in Europe, for obvious reasons. Like, if you grow up as an Ashkenazi Jew, and I say Ashkenazi specifically because for non-Ashkenazi Jews in Israel, it's a whole other story. But if you grow up as an Ashkenazi Jew in Israel, you grow up with a huge amount of privilege and a huge amount of hegemony. And to you, Judaism is it's like everywhere. You don't even notice that you're a minority, right? You notice the first time you moved to Israel. So all these Israelis who moved to Berlin you'd think like, oh, all Jews in Berlin understand each other. It's like, no, like it's a very different experience, right? And I really struggled with that, and I didn't really want to be involved in Jewish organizing at the time because I felt like I didn't feel comfortable. And the the so the Jewish Bund, which formed in the wake of the Jüdische Antifa kind of declining, was an homage to the historical Jewish Labor Bund. But it's not the same thing, and it's important to state. Like it's not really seen as a revival. It's kind of more. It's called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Bund rather than the Jewish Labor Bund. So it's kind of a spin. And they were. So the Bund was a labor movement, a socialist labor movement that sought to unite Jewish workers in Eastern Europe against capitalism, and they were opposed to the idea of Jewish national unity. So the idea of Jewish national unity is basically the idea that Jews have more in common with each other than, well, working class Jews, for example, have more in common with each other than with other working class people. And the Jewish Labor Bund were against this idea, right? So working class Jews had more in common with working class black folks than with upper class Jews. Right? And Zionism preaches this idea of Jewish national unity, right? That like you're Jewish first before you're anything else. And part of what I think the formation of the Jewish Bund, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Bund in Berlin was about was, well, it was many things, but one of the things was saying we're as much in solidarity with other communities as we are with each other, but we're also in solidarity with each other. And also to bring some of these class politics back into the equation, which is so often overlooked, right?
So maybe kind of go into that question a bit. How did you feel like your experience was generally within broader German society?
So I, having lived, I grew up in Belgium, but having been in London for some time and spent more time here again. When I first went back to Berlin, it was kind of a mixed. And again, it would be complicated to tell you the whole chronology of all this because I'm an international Jew. But Berlin was both, almost similarly to Zionism, actually, what I was saying at the beginning in terms of this like queer safe haven and like being a place where like, you can go clubbing and you can go dancing and you can have a great time and you can feel free apparently. And then like on the one hand, more so than anywhere else I'd ever lived, and on the other hand, I'd never felt so tokenized, fetishized, and to a degree racialized as a Jew than I did when I was living in Berlin in that period. And it just got worse and worse and worse as time got on. At the same time as Palestinians were being even more racialized, right, in tandem with each other, that there's been this kind of progressive worsening of both anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian racism in the city in very different ways, right? And I felt that in my body when I was there. I really did, and maybe I was more sensitive to it than was necessary. But I think at the time I remember thinking this doesn't feel safe. And it's interesting in hindsight to see how true that's become in terms of how the German state has just targeted anti-Zionist Jews and Palestinians like so disproportionately to other communities in the city. It's this weird thing of like both being this incredible space to be queer and kind of a terrible place to be a minority of any other kind. It's my sense of that city.
I mean, you are obviously not only an activist. That's also the
Yeah.
reason why we're speaking to you. But another reason we're speaking to you is you're also an academic.
Yeah.
And you practice both together.
Yeah.
You've written that you want your work to be in the name of politics, not in the name of suffering.
Yeah.
Why did you write this?
There are many, many ways of answering this question. A very clear one as someone who grows up with Zionism is that Zionism tells you, and Zionists will tell you, that you should listen to them because they are Jewish and they've experienced suffering. And it uses suffering as a way to legitimize a political position that is completely insane. So what I'm trying to do there is to say, like, you shouldn't just listen to me because of my identity, right? And this is still something I struggle with, because I'm not trying to say that my identity doesn't matter to why I do what I do, but it's not the reason why my opinions on this should be considered correct or not, right? And I think in the last 10 or so years, maybe this has got better recently, but we do tend to like fetishize, I think on the left, this idea that if you've suffered from some various form of oppression, then it means that you know the right answer to how to deal with it. And I think the story of Israel shows that that's just not the case. And so many people around me who are still Jewish people who are still Zionists will continuously use this idea that because their parents were Holocaust survivors or because they have some connection to the Shoah, that means they know the right answer, you know, and I just don't think that's how these things work.
How do you navigate that in your activism? The tension between, on the one hand, you know, it's about politics.
Yeah.
But with the Jewish Bund, for example, it's also about, I mean, being Jewish is also
Yeah.
political, you know.
Definitely.
And I often see anti-Zionist Jews who strategically use their identity in order to, for example, disrupt a certain understanding of what Judaism or
Right.
being Jewish means.
Right.
So, and yeah, I guess there's not an easy answer to this, but maybe you.
No, there's not an easy answer, and it's you know, like when you're organizing or doing activist work as in anti-Zionist Jewish spaces, it's really difficult because you're like, do we do this as Jews first or not?
Mhm.
And sometimes it's useful to do things as Jews first in the Palestine Solidarity movement. Sometimes it's better to take a step back and not.
Mm.
And that can kind of depend on the case. But I think generally one of the issues with the way that Germany understands, I mean, Europe generally, I don't want to exceptionalize Germany, but Germany has a very particular way of doing this. The German state, also a lot of Germans more generally, the way that racial histories of genocide or peoples who've experienced genocide and colonialism are understood is very often as people who are reduced to suffering.
Yeah.
So you're reduced to death, essentially. I mean, even the way that Palestine is understood right now. Hanal Taher speaks, for example, about the way that, you know, there's this idea that Germans don't know that there's a genocide going on, but she argues that they do know, they just don't care.
Mm.
Because of this pure reduction, this reduction to death. You know, like Palestinians don't have life.
Mm.
And I think the more that politics comes from suffering, the more we can reproduce that narrative in all cases.
Mm.
And you see it really strongly with the Shoah and the way that the Holocaust is kind of taught about in German schools, the way that Jewish life is taught about.
Mm.
I think most Germans, maybe this is changing, but most Germans who've never met Jews will immediately think of the Holocaust when they meet Jews.
Mm.
Right? Whereas I've never been to Auschwitz. I'm not interested in going to Auschwitz, even though I write about genocide.
Yeah.
Like, my Jewish identity is not about the Holocaust. It's about, like, practicing a religion.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, let's turn to your book and your academic work.
Yeah. Mostly
but-
unpublished. But yeah.
At some point,
Yeah.
you were able to
Yeah.
read it, but we had the luxury of engaging in it. You write about the entanglements and cross influences of German attempts at reparatory justice for its colonial history and its culture and politics of memory regarding their perpetrator role in the Shoah.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe to start off with,
Mm-hmm.
can you give us and our listeners a short overview of German colonialism and its afterlives in Southwest Africa?
Yeah. So this is a big history,
Yeah.
a big and complex.
It feels wrong to reduce it to
Yeah.
one question. There's so much we want to talk about.
No, there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot to say, but you know, I can give you like a very brief history,
Yeah.
If that helps. So the story kind of begins within the context of the scramble for Africa, which is Europe's carving out of the African continent, which really wasn't that long ago. So it's 1884. the Berlin Conference takes place, where Germany, which is newly unified, is one of the participants, right? And quickly builds one of the largest colonial holdings in the world at the time.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, it's easy to think of Germany as having a short-lived colonial empire, but actually at this moment, it was the fourth largest. And one of these colonies, amongst others, was German Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. And this was a settler colony. It became a settler colony. So for those who don't know what settler colonialism is, it's a form of colonialism where settlers are sent to seize the land of indigenous people in order to populate it for the purposes of expanding living space, right? So places like Canada, New Zealand, the US, Palestine. Right? And Namibia was a German settler colony. And as tends to happen in settler colonies, or as always happens in settler colonies, according to most indigenous studies scholars, when you're seizing the land of indigenous people, there tends to be genocide involved in that process. So the Herero and Nama, Damara and San people, who were indigenous people, have lived in various different parts of the territory at that time. German state, along with German business people, were slowly encroaching upon their land and also implementing legal systems that were incredibly discriminatory. So killing numerous Africans when one settler was killed, right, in revenge. So, like forms of retaliation that were extraordinarily racist. And the story of the Herero and Nama genocide sometimes begins again with the suffering, with the genocide, but actually the story begins with enormous indigenous resistance. This is important. Planned resistance over many years of different kinds. So the Nama people have different forms of resistance. The Herero people have different forms of resistance. And most famously, the Herero revolt in 1904 killed up to 200 German settlers. I don't know. And in response, a German general named Lothar von Trotter issues an extermination order, which is known to be when the genocide begins. And that order is an order of annihilation. Right? And we see this across settler colonial context in response to resistance. And Herero people are driven into the desert and purposefully starved. Then an extermination order is also issued for the Nama people. Concentration camps are built, and there's about 50% death rate in these camps. These are not camps that look exactly like Nazi concentration camps. It's way too easy to make that analogy. This is before then.
Yeah.
They're specifically settler colonial, but there is mass death at an enormous scale. This is what's known as the first genocide of the 20th century that took place in German colonial Africa. But what is interesting and particularly depressing about German Southwest Africa and contemporary Namibia, like other settler colonies, is that this is in a way ongoing, because the land that was taken away from indigenous people continues to be settled by white people, even in a now independent black-run African state. So, and a number of those people are descendants of those Germans who took that land, and that means that there's an ongoing settler colonial process in that country, like in South Africa, that has led to all sorts of ongoing harms that need to be redressed, like in settler colonial contexts.
You went to Namibia.
I have.
And I think it's also important to mention that Namibia only gained its independence in 1990.
Yeah.
Basically when Germany was reunified, I guess. I mean, it's interesting to see how these...
Same time.
Yeah, these timelines are very different, but then also overlap. I mean, I don't want to compare these two, but I think when I read that, I was like, fuck. That's crazy.
It matters, It matters also because East Germany was much more supportive of Namibian independence than West Germany was. West Germany supported apartheid, so that story matters in the sense that once East Germany disappeared, you didn't have the same kind of solidarity that you used to have before, for all of its faults, for all of East Germany's various faults.
And when you went to Namibia for your research, you've seen many things, and you describe them in your book, and you try to build context and study German Namibians. And
Mm-hmm.
how they live and how what can sound very abstract, settler colonialism, how that
Mm-hmm.
manifests in institutions and
Mhm.
everyday life.
Mhm. One of the things that I was really struck by and interested in when I was there was what Germanness looks like in Namibia today, and what it looks like is it like continued reproduction of forms of white supremacy that are particular to Germany, right? So whether that's in the most extreme form, literal Nazism, which has a long history and legacy in Namibia, including some folks who were involved in supporting the NSU 2.0, or less explicitly Nazi, but a kind of nostalgia for the colonial era, or a kind of continued living in colonial time. So almost living as if colonialism hasn't ended, right? But I mean, in Namibia, to be clear, although I do see it as having settler colonial characteristics, colonialism has ended.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like in the US or
Yeah.
in Palestine. But there are still many people there who continue to live under a kind of colonial temporality, and to treat black people as if they are subhuman. Right? And it's astounding how much that is still present there. And that is a different kind of racism to Nazism, but it's very much still prevalent. And there's a number of Germans who also have dual citizenship, who are continuously doing that. Another example would be there's almost a establishment of people writing history books in Namibia, but those history books are genocide denial books that attempt to be scholarship, but they still contribute towards a kind of intellectual establishment that denies the Herero and Nama genocide, but that also then reverberates in Germany itself, because those books are bought in Germany.
The question of time or temporality is really interesting. I'm not sure how I can ask this question, but because my next question would be about reparations and the fact that a lot of effective communities from the genocide and its aftermath have pushed for reparations.
Yeah.
But reparation also implies that the history is over and can be transformed into a better future.
Yeah.
So how have different actors within Namibia, but also within the Herero and Nama people, how have they tried to articulate this demand for reparations? How have they used the state, for example, as a vehicle to bring that about? Or how have they maybe dismissed the state as an actor that cannot actually bring justice to them?
Yeah. That's a really important question. And I think it's important first to say for all listeners that no post-colonial state is a monolith, right? And the global south is not a monolith. So when we talk about reparations, also more generally than the context of Namibia, also in the context of Holocaust reparations, it's never simple, and it's never just about the state representing everyone, right? And throughout the global south, whether it's the Caribbean or throughout Africa, states claiming reparations from Europe can be very problematic because they claim to represent the experiences of a whole population. Right? And even post-colonial states have engaged in different forms of ethnic cleansing. So, I mean, look at contemporary India, for example. Like, India might be seeking reparations from Britain, but at the same time is basically engaging in ethnic cleansing in Muslim population. So in Namibia, I wouldn't say it's as bad as that, but the Herero and Nama people have historically, since 1990, since Namibian independence, have to a degree been excluded from the top layer of Namibian politics. So the Namibian state itself has not necessarily been that interested in representing their interests. And what that means is the Namibian state has made reparations claims against Germany, and there were ongoing negotiations ending up in the first big reconciliation agreement between European power and a former colony, which is very important. But
that was in 2015, right?
2021.
Oh,
It started in 2015 and then I think it was 2021 that the negotiations were wrapped up.
I see, yeah.
And Germany admitted that it would have been called a genocide according to contemporary international law, and offered 1.1 billion euros in development aid as a form of in order to heal the wounds, they didn't use the term reparation. They said healing the wounds. And they said, with this, the case is closed. This is literally the language of the agreement. So like, with this offer of 1.1 billion euros, this history is settled financially and also emotionally. So for, I would say, the majority of Herero and Nama people, this was an affront to them because they feel that this is not reparations, right? This is a kind of whitewashing of the history. And they've pursued various different avenues in order to get Germany to go further, one of which was suing the German state in a New York court, which I've written an article about. And yeah, I think there are also now ongoing illegal challenges to the negotiation agreement that are happening within Namibia itself. So the key thing to understand is that reparations are never simple. And then it's never just like, there's the good side and the bad side, and the good side asks for money from the bad side. There are all sorts of different actors who have different interests in seeking compensation.
And what about the German state as an actor? Why did they engage with these talks, and what's their interest?
That is such a good question, because I think if you compare, to give Germany some due, if we compare Germany, for instance, to the UK, I teach my students this, where if you go on the UK's website of its relationship to the Caribbean, it doesn't even mention that Jamaica is a former colony, let alone that reparations might be due, right? So this is how bad things are in the UK. So I think one of the reasons is that Germany prides itself on being the Erinnerungsweltmeister, and of doing memory politics very well, and of engaging in the past, with its difficult past, whether that's National Socialism or the DDR, right? And I think at one level, amongst like liberal elites in Germany, there's a genuine sense amongst some people, a genuine sense that, well, if we're the Erinnerungsweltmeister, then we better tick all the boxes. That's one reason. Maybe the less cynical reason. The other reason, I think, has to do with resource, and I think all former European powers, given the rise of China and China's kind of influence on the African continent, want to continue to have an influence. So how do you continue to have influence in Africa if you were once a major colonial power? One of the ways is through a softer form of politics, which says, well, we recognize that we colonized you. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you development aid, and part of that aid or part of that support will be, for instance, the building of a hydrogen plant that we can then use as energy, and you'll give us contracts and we'll give you some form of recognition. And I think it's become harder and harder the more confident the African states have become for European states to continue to have the influence that they have. And that's a more cynical reason. And the third reason is because of the unrelenting, organized campaign of reparations activists, people of African descent in Germany, and also Africans themselves.
I want to talk about the Erinnerungsweltmeister point you just said. So, what you also write about is that the discourse, because we've been speaking about reparations now and reparatory justice a lot in the case of colonialism and colonial afterlives, and specifically the genocide in Southwest Africa and Namibia nowadays. You wrote that a lot of discourse in Germany surrounding reparations for the victims of German colonialism is underwritten by the so-called, quotes, grammar of the Holocaust, or, quote, the Jewish precedent. What exactly do you mean by that? If you could explain this.
I mean, the best place to start is to start with Holocaust reparations in a way, because Holocaust reparations didn't all happen in one phase. They happened in like multiple phases, right? And the first phase was predominantly bilateral between the German government and the State of Israel. But it was also between the German government and a group of Jewish organizations called the Jewish Claims Conference. And this was what I would call the first phase. And the second phase happened in the 1990s. And in that phase, a lot of it moved to the US. And the way that Germany kind of deals with the Namibian case is very different to the way it dealt with the Holocaust, but there are also some similarities. And one of those similarities is I would argue that in both cases, there's an attempt to whitewash these histories through reparations. So we can talk about similarities and we can talk about differences. Right? So the differences are, well, they might not be obvious to listeners, but they should be fairly obvious, right? In the sense that this has come extremely late. It's like 100 years afterwards. Germany isn't using the term reparations, for example. They are not particularly interested in paying reparations to individuals. But there are similarities in the sense that I don't think Holocaust reparations were in any way perfect. And in many ways they were, and Daniel Mawecki has written about this, but in many ways they were about whitewashing Germany's crimes and reestablishing themselves as a civilized nation through a form of Erinnerungspolitik. Right? And in some ways we're seeing the same thing with Namibia. So there's a grammar of the Shoah in the sense that there's a way of thinking about the Holocaust that is being applied to this case. And the other argument, which you will hear more, is the Shoah has been addressed in Germany, whereas colonialism has not. Right? Part of what I'm trying to say in the book is that I think neither case has been well addressed in very different ways, right? But in some ways that are similar. And one of those ways is through a politics of recognition and in the Jewish case reparation, but that doesn't actually do anything about structural dispossession. And if you look at the 1950s moment, in some ways, and Mawecki argues this, that in some ways the Jewish problem was solved through Zionism. Right? And reparations were not really compensation for the wound, as Germany likes to say, but the formation of a Jewish settler colony. And I think it's really important that we scrutinize both cases like really closely, and that's difficult to do, but it's important.
I think it's quite important to kind of flesh out a bit also for our listeners how these two seemingly not on the face of it related histories, ongoing histories, apart from obviously Germany being the perpetrator, how they actually relate also in cases of reparatory justice, etc. But you also, and getting to the next question, you also research and write about the relationship between German colonialism itself and Zionism.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do now. Yeah.
Or you're trying to get there, or doing it already. I think.
Yeah.
We've read parts of it. However, you don't. I mean, what we've read from you don't simply kind of see them as they're both forms of colonialism, so they have structural similarities, kind of way, which is also very obviously important and important to write about and true. But you kind of highlight the very particular ways in which political Zionism of the late 19th and early 20th century very specifically valorized the German colonial model. Can you maybe like elaborate on that and the relation, and specifically how these influences are, where might still be visible in occupation and apartheid regimes, as well as the genocidal dynamics
in Palestine? So I think one of the things that is interesting when people do colonial studies, settler colonial studies, post-colonial studies, is that it's easy to reduce national histories of colonialism to the territories that were formerly colonized. So, for example, studying the British Empire in relation solely to the territories that it colonized. The same with Germany, right? But the thing with empire is that everybody was talking to each other, everybody was learning from each other. I mean, literally in the same rooms. Look at the Berlin Africa Conference. They're literally sitting next to each other. This idea that these are discrete territorial units that colonize discrete territorial units doesn't actually make sense. And I think since writing my book, and I'm not a historian, so the book is very contemporary, even though it brings historical elements, but I've still realized that I think there's a problem with thinking about something like German colonialism and thinking only about the places that it colonized, right? And it's one of the things that leads people to say, oh, well, Germany doesn't need to deal with colonial racism in the same way because it was smaller or something. Or like, I mean, as if the size of the territories have anything to do with the kind of epistemic production that comes from that period. And one of the things that is incredibly interesting to me that became apparent to me more and more, and that I'm reading more scholarship, the small amount of scholarship that there is on this topic I'm reading more and more about, is the way that early Zionist elites, right? And it's really important to me to distinguish between Zionist elites and like the average working class Jew who supports Zionism in Eastern Europe, who is mainly spending their time being formed by these elites. But how early Zionist elites were not entirely, but very often interested and influenced by the German Empire, right, and by German colonialism. So someone like Theodor Herzl was very enamored by what he saw as the efficiency. And an example that is really important, I think, and that I think has not been discussed enough in these conversations is something like a man called Arthur Ruppin, who was the founder of Tel Aviv, who was a out-and-out eugenicist. Okay? Kind of like brought everything about the eugenics movement in that period, including the idea that Jews were racially inferior. And a lot of what he was drawing on was the eugenics movement that was extremely prominent in colonial Germany, right? And that experimented on Herero and Nama skulls, for example. And he takes that knowledge and is involved in the foundation of the Israeli state. And one of the things that he does is he thinks about Palestine in terms of Menschenmaterial, and the colonization of Palestine is inextricable from the eugenics movement. It's just, there is no way of reading that history without understanding the influence of eugenics. And I think part of that, not only, but part of that comes from forms of knowledge that were produced in the German colonial era. And so he would, for instance, think about which Ashkenazi Jews were fit enough to settle the land, right? Or he would see Arab Jews of various kinds as racially inferior, right, and in needing of saving. This was the case across the Zionist establishment, right? Palestinians, of course, I mean, he writes about, I was looking at something that he wrote recently about how Palestinians are worth less than a tree, because at least a tree you can plant and it will grow, whereas Palestinians are useless. So I'm trying to think about how this, how thinking more about German colonialism might help to understand Palestine as well as the territories that Germany have formerly colonized.
Maybe it's also worth talking about the role German Jews had within the German Empire and how they, as a racialized group that faced structural repression, basically, how they interacted with German colonialism and German imperialism.
Yeah.
Because there's also not one single history here.
The one thing that needs to be said, and that is really difficult, is that like German Jews in the early 20th century were, and today, experience racial discrimination, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't have the agency to be discriminatory themselves, right? And to have internalized some of the forms of German racism that were very prominent, that have been very prominent. I mean, any German, right? If you grew up in the education system. And German Jews in the early 20th century and up until today were not uniformly anti-racist. That some of them were anti-colonial, and some of them were interested in the German colonial expansion and in German colonial racism and in the eugenics movement. I think it's really important to understand that no oppressed population is incapable of taking up discriminatory forms of violence, right? But I think it's really difficult when it comes to German Jews and European Jews generally in the context of empire, because it's also so often used as a trope to say that Jews drove empire, right? It's an anti-Semitic trope, right? And that is really dangerous and problematic and terrifying. But I am still interested in this question of what does it mean to, as a European Jew in the 20th century, to internalize colonial racism while also yourself being a victim of anti-Semitism, and those two things happening at once. And I think if we look at some German Jews today who are speaking loudly against Palestinian humanity, I do sit there and I ask the question of like, how can you not see that this is also about you? Right? But somehow you've internalized the idea that it isn't. That you can, and newspapers like the Jüdische Allgemeine and like the Jewish Chronicle in Britain, also organizations like the Zentralrat. I mean, they're not, and like the Board of Deputies in the UK, they're not completely immune from this, right? And I find that important but difficult. Yeah.
One argument that I've come across as well is that participating within the German imperial project also allowed Jews to prove that within a context where they often face the accusation that they're not really German or not treated as being German, that they can prove they're German. But
I think that is one argument, and I think it's also one of the arguments for why so many European Jews took up Zionism, was to show that they were good Europeans and they could do colonialism like the French or the British could. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have the agency to make that decision.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there were alternatives, and there are always alternatives. The Jewish Bund existed at the time, right? And I think it's that space between you can make that choice. And I mean, in some cases, it might mean that someone kills you. Right? It's like sometimes those choices are catastrophic, but you can make that choice. And I think that space is what I'm interested in.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit again, but we're still staying
the
same territory. Since the 7th of October, I've often, or not often, but sometimes encountered the argument that the Herero and Nama resistance against German colonialism and the subsequent genocide has similarities to the genocide that is taking place in Palestine.
Yeah.
Are you aware of whether within Namibia, the Herero and Nama people how have they reacted to the genocide in Palestine? The solidarity between the victims of these violences.
So from what I've seen, there's been a lot of solidarity, and a letter that was issued as well to, I think it was from the NTLA, I might be wrong, but that spoke specifically about the similarities and the shared history of settler colonial violence. Right? So a strong understanding of a similarity. Yeah. And that's so important because I think also in Germany, there's a lot of people who are willing to listen to the idea that the Herero and Nama genocide has similarities with the Shoah, or that it maybe led to the Shoah, or that it had, I don't believe that, but that it has strong connections to the Shoah. But I think there will be some people who will find it a lot harder to say that it has similarities to the genocide in Palestine. And it's really amazing that there is that kind of solidarity.
Yeah. One theme that has crystallized so far in our conversation is that past and present cannot obviously be easily separated. I think this is a good transition to a buzzword that has often come up in this podcast generally, but also you write about Vergangenheitsbewältigung.
Yeah.
Basically the culture and politics of coming to terms with the past, quote unquote. You've argued that state-led Vergangenheitsbewältigung can also be understood as a practice of racial governance in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So first, for us and our listeners, what really is racial governance, and what do you mean by Vergangenheitsbewältigung being a mode of organizing difference in Germany?
Yeah. So this is also something that's in the book. We've talked a lot about settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing and genocide, right? But to an extent, the kind of anarchist in me sees all nation states as involved in ethnic cleansing of some kind, right? So like, the British state has historically been involved in ethnic cleansing outside of itself, but also within, whether that's in Ireland or also in Wales and Scotland, and all of the nation states that we live in, including in Europe, are artificial constructions, right? That bring together extremely diverse populations in order to create a national myth, right? And that means that states have to find ways to govern difference in order to legitimize themselves, right? And also to avoid to reproduce nationalism and to avoid various forms of resistance. And that's what I mean by racial governance. Right? So it's a way of dealing with racial difference, right? And different European states do it very differently. They have different tactics, right? To ensure that people, in the end, it's ensuring that people are kind of subdued. So they don't question nationalism, or they don't question the state, or they don't question the legitimacy of the state. I mean, talk about the state of Israel's right to exist, right? I mean, any state's right to exist. Right? At a certain point, the populations that are like incredibly discriminated against, whether that's migrants or Jews or Palestinians or people coming on small boats, right? At a certain point, people do resist, right? And I think racial governance is partly about preventing that. And to give you an example, the British government, the British state, its way of doing this, I would argue, and others have argued, is through what's called multiculturalism, which is a state practice which doesn't really exist in Germany. I mean, people talk about multiculti, but it's not in the way that it exists here. And anyone who's lived in the UK will know how this looks here, which was a project that came about especially since the 90s of kind of seeing a population as made up of discrete communities that have specific boundaries. So you have a Jewish community, you have a Muslim community, you have a black community, right? And each one is given various rights based on its community status. Right? So for example, I went to a Jewish school. You're allowed to have faith schools for like various communities. And there's this idea in Britain that this is a form of inclusion, right? So it means that we all get along, and I think it has connections to the history of indirect rule, like British indirect rule. Right? So you manage populations you don't just put yourself in authority over them. You kind of let them manage themselves. Let's put it that way. So you let communities manage themselves. Right? So the way I grew up was very much, well, I was in Belgium, but when I moved to the UK and like British Jews generally, it's a very like almost like self-governing community, right? And the state doesn't interfere that much. The complete opposite to that would be somewhere like France. And this is really interesting to me, and we could talk about it for ages. But I think it has, we can talk about the positives and negatives of each one, but in the end, they're all trying to subdue people, right? And in the UK, it can often look like, we all live side by side. It's but it's literally like side by side. Like there isn't like, is there that much mixing? Not necessarily. At least in the 90s. And I think in Germany, what I'm trying to explore a bit in that chapter is that that's not the approach they took, right? In relation to guest workers, for example, in relation to the growing, is it really growing? Germany's always been a country of like a racially diverse place. So I don't know whether that argument makes sense, but in some ways, growing racial diversity in the country, right? So what approach are you going to do? Are you going to go the British route? Are you going to go the French route? What are you going to do? And I think one of the things that Germany decided to do was to go down this route of saying that we're all one because we're all part of a country that has experienced this huge national trauma. And like, that's what we're going to tell you. And that's what makes us German. The British knew that they couldn't do that. They weren't going to be like, we've all colonized the world. Like, and they weren't gonna, I don't think that would work here. And also, but I think Germany has, to be really cynical about it, right? And I don't want to say that there's absolutely nothing to Vergangenheitsbewältigung, because I think there have been moments where it's been really important. But in general, I think it's a nation building project. And we're seeing that, like, I mean, with Esra Azurek's work, like, you see it playing out exactly how that looks, right? So it's like you're included if you can acknowledge this apparent national trauma. The argument that I'm trying to make is more broad than that, but I think in its crux, that's it. Yeah. Whereas in France, for example, I think it's much more like the legacy of laicité, secularism, French Revolution.
Okay, so we're moving to the end.
Okay.
So we started on a personal note.
Yeah.
And, obviously also political, but we know they cannot be separated. we want our final questions. We have 2 left. Then Valentin will ask the final one. Want them to end on that note as well.
Okay.
So we have already touched upon various layers of who you are and what you do. But one thing we haven't yet talked about, and generally have not delved into very much in the span of this podcast, generally, is queerness. You write that queerness sits under the surface, quote, of your work. Can you delve into this for us?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so cool that you read the whole thing. That's like one paragraph of my dissertation. But it's really important because I had initially wanted to do queer studies and gender and sexuality studies, and this is like quite a big jump in a way, a big difference. And I was trying to kind of understand for myself as I was writing, okay, why doesn't this appear in my writing in the way that I want it to? And I think, I mean, I also once had a professor that told me that if you do queer studies, you'll never get a job. So that was the one. That was one of the influences. Yeah, she was like. So I was just like, okay, I'm not gonna do it then. But, yeah. But then I had to think about, okay, what are the ways in which this still influences the way I think? And I think queer studies is like, I don't think about this in queerness in relation to my identity as a queer person. Like, I think about it in relation to what like queer theory, but also like the concept of queerness generally offers, which is a kind of, I mean, firstly, anti-identitarian politics, but also a politics of a kind of methodological anarchism, right? Which you probably saw in the book. And that is the reason why I ended up doing this PhD in anthropology department, because I wanted to be able to move across time and across place and to kind of use different methods in different contexts and to talk about myself and to write against this idea of academia as like a form of mastery of a subject where you take yourself out completely. And there's I consider quite patriarchal, and I don't think you have to be like quote unquote queer person to take up a queer method, right? It's kind of like different ways of writing and different ways of thinking across time and space. And I was really lucky to work with an anthropologist called Elizabeth Povinelli, who does that in her writing. And, you know, people think it's crazy, but I just really wanted to do that. And hopefully I can stay in academia even having written like that. But I definitely come across people who really don't like it. But yeah.
We like it.
Good. I'm
This should be
glad.
enough.
Yeah, and the other thing, I mean,
We
like,
can't give you a job though.
yeah, no, I think the other thing, I mean, my PhD was in anthropology. I'm in an international relations department. My MA was in politics. My undergrad was in sociology. Like, you know, because discipline. The other thing with queerness is that discipline just feels ridiculous. You know, it's like, what's the point? Yeah.
We started this conversation by asking you about your sense of belonging or not belonging, and let's end here as
Okay.
well. Interestingly, this is an arc that a lot of our conversations have.
Okay.
The feeling of losing or not finding a sense of home. We talked about it with Tomer Dotan Dreyfus last episode. He used the word Keinheimisch, Einheimisch. But also the active effort to create a home outside the grid of the nation state that confines us to certain identities or does not met them in the first place.
Yeah. Fuck that.
You write that, quote, the future of racialized others in Europe is not elsewhere.
Yeah.
But neither is it in, quote, Europe. Where is it?
Oh my God. I love that. Do you know what? I feel like that's the entirety of what I'm trying to say is that sentence of what that whole PhD was about.
That's why you picked it for our last
hopefully
question.
that came across. Yeah. You know, I really grapple with this because one of the things that some anti-Zionists, I think it's overdone how much this happens, will sometimes say is like, Jews should go back to Europe, right? Where they belong. And there's this idea that, I mean, my great grandparents were all in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe, and that somehow, my true belonging is in Poland or Russia. And there's a kind of saying in the Bundist movement, called Doikite, which means here-ness in Yiddish, and it basically means wherever we are, that's our home. But I don't know about that. Like, I don't think either has to be our home. Like, for me personally, in the sense that I reject Zionism, but that doesn't mean I embrace being in Europe. Like, why should I, given what's happened on this continent? And I think to say to Ashkenazi Jews, go back to Europe, and I don't mean this as it's explicitly as a critique of anti-Zionist, of this kind of anti-Zionist posture, but all of anyone who has been on the underside of European genocide in some way has to grapple with that, or of racial, there's no, like, okay, you go back, like, you're Iranian, you've lived in Germany for 20 years. Does that mean you should go to Iran and Iran's your home? Not necessarily, right? But it also doesn't mean Germany's your home. And I think the task for all of us is to try and sit in the middle somehow. Exit is rarely gonna solve everything, Migration might help, right? Like, but it's not gonna solve everything. Right? I mean, migration is also different to colonizing somewhere, to be clear. But for me, it's like I'm not gonna be like, I'm a European Jew. That means that I have no connection to Palestine. That means I just want to stay here in this wonderful continent. And nothing will ever happen to us here. Here we're safe. There we're not. It's like, no, of course, Jews aren't safe in Europe. And I think we're seeing that in Germany now, especially. No racialized people is safe. I mean, this idea that only Jews would somehow get safety is ridiculous. So I think this is the question that I don't have an answer to, I'm afraid. But like, how do you? And one of the things I say, even those of us who are still in this Europe that has done all this chaos, inflicted all this chaos on ourselves and to other people, is like, how can we live here whilst working to, like, in a way, transform the idea of Europe itself? But I think it will be a never-ending project.
Thank you so much. It was such an insightful and beautiful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you, the listener, has any questions or ideas, please let us know. Our email is in the show notes. That's where you can also find all the books and articles mentioned in this episode. If you want to listen to more conversations about German memory politics and its connections to Palestine-Israel, check out our other episodes.